Hi, this is Deena Thomson, author of Fallen Poppies, and this is Chapter 10.
Chapter 10. Alan went to work as usual the next morning, but couldn't shake feeling restless and nervous. Something deep in his bones told him to pick up everything and everyone and run. When he voiced his thoughts out loud to Jonah, he was surprised by his reaction.
"Alan, we could be jumping to conclusions. We got ourselves a nice little life here, and I'm tired of running."
Alan, feeling defeated, nodded. He too was tired of running. He stood beside his friend, wanting him to take the burden he suddenly felt off his shoulders.
"Be careful today,"
Alan said, holding Shauna in his arms. She was beginning to be too big to carry. Her long legs dangled over Alan's hips as she clutched her slender arms around his neck.
"We will,"
Jonah replied. JoBeth came up from behind him.
"Good. Kiss Shauna and we'll be off."
Alan smiled. Shauna stretched her arms out to JoBeth. She hugged and kissed the 6-year-old. Once Alan and Shauna left, she went to the water basin beside the dinner table and began washing up. Edna needed to be milked, and she wanted to make Jonah's favorite dish for supper, roast pork with potatoes and carrots and thick gravy. Later, JoBeth sat humming on a stool, tugging Edna's teats. Milk squirted into the pail, making a pleasant hissing sound. Jonah was behind the house down the creek, slaughtering one of the largest pigs for supper. It should supply the meat for many meals to come. Suddenly, a thundering roar pierced the air, causing the world around JoBeth to vibrate. Edna stumbled backward and mooed, kicking the pail of milk over. JoBeth jumped up, her heart leaping into her throat. Her hands raced to her neck as dread filled her. Something terrible had happened. She ran outside to see where the noise was coming from, looking toward the creek. A man, who looked like the fellow Simpson, with a shotgun, ran away. JoBeth's eyes darted one way and then another, and she started to run in slow motion. Frantic, she called out Jonah's name as she turned to the side of the house. With each step, her stomach twisted tighter with dread. Her knuckles turned white from her clenched fists. The sight of 2 lumps slumped on the ground made her gasp, and she screamed Jonah's name as she ran closer. Jonah lay motionless beside the butchered pig. "Oh, no!" she moaned as she fell beside his crumpled form. A dark pool of blood encased him. The source of the blood was a deep wound in his stomach. "No!" JoBeth sobbed, tears falling uncontrollably. Panic overwhelmed her as she gently touched Jonah's sweaty brow.
"JoBeth,"
he whispered, spitting blood through stained red teeth. "Oh, no, Jonah," she whimpered, picking his head up and cradling it in her lap. Grasping JoBeth's arm, he winced, coughing.
Dying."
Deep into his sockets, his eyes sank. His skin was sickly pale, and the whites of his eyes were bloodshot and stained a jaundiced yellow. "No," JoBeth whined. "I won't let you—" She hugged his limp head close to her heaving chest.
"JoBeth, you have to listen."
Jonah wheezed again. His head felt fuzzy, and he had a hard time thinking straight. JoBeth threw back her head and wailed, her heart breaking. "No, I won't let another brother die. The people I love can't always die. How much do I have to lose for my sins?" Jonah's voice was raspy and labored as he tried to speak, his mouth filling with fresh blood. JoBeth felt a pang of sorrow as she watched him struggle to talk. A wet tear ran down her cheek, and she wiped it away with her fingers, her expression morphing into a deep frown.
"Listen to me. Remember what I said about life not always giving you what you want."
"Stop!" she yelled, her head bowed in defeat as she desperately tried to hold on to Jonah. "This can't be happening. Life can't be this unfair." Her tears fell on Jonah's pale face.
"I have to say what is on my mind before I meet my maker."
Jonah's eyes widened, the fading orbs drilling into JoBeth.
"I don't want you to mope around after I'm gone. I will be with God and baby Jonah. I'm not sad to go to them."
Weakly, he reached above his head and grabbed JoBeth's hand, squeezing with all his strength.
"And I will always be with you."
He patted her hand to his heart. Blood bubbled from the wound in his belly.
"You gotta be strong for Alan and Shauna. They need you."
JoBeth was bawling, but she continued to listen. Covered in Jonah's blood, she clung to him, hoping her love was strong enough to keep him with her.
"Alan,"
he spat, his voice becoming weak.
"He loves you so much. He wants to do good by you and Shauna."
He closed his eyes, his chest not moving. "Jonah!" JoBeth screamed in terror. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked around aimlessly, unable to focus.
"Don't cry, JoBeth."
Jonah smiled a bloody smile. His eyes seemed fixed, gazing at the sky.
"I'll be watching over your little boy, telling him his ma loved him."
"Don't say that. I need you here with me," JoBeth cried, rubbing her bloody hand across her already blood-smeared face. Her arms tightened around Jonah's heavy head. "I love you. You are my best friend, the other half of my soul. I can't go on without you. How will Shauna be? Alan, we need you. We are not us without you. Don't you understand? You can't go. You can't."
"I love you, but it's time for you to go on alone without me. You don't need my hand to hold anymore."
He smiled peacefully.
"Tell Alan I love him, and our girl Shauna,"
Jonah squeaked in a high voice. Shaking her head in disagreement, JoBeth began to rock back and forth, a moan coming raspy and wet from the back of her throat. He grabbed JoBeth's arms, embracing her body weakly.
I can't see.
"Oh, Jonah!" JoBeth cried, hugging his limp body. "Please don't die. Please, please don't die. Don't leave me alone."
The living needs you, not the dead. Don't make me cry when I'm gone, 'cause you crying down here."
Jonah barely whispered.
"You promise me."
He strained. She lifted his face and gently cupped it in her blood-stained hands, tenderly bending her face to his. With her chin resting on his forehead and hers on his, she gently placed an upside-down kiss on Jonah's bloody wet lips. She closed her eyes, feeling Jonah's final breath, warm and moist against her lips, and threw back her head, howling, feral, like an injured animal. Her hair whipped around her face, hiding the sorrow she couldn't hold back. She wailed out her pain to the clear blue sky as she held tight to her friend's lifeless body. Alan walked into the small house, feeling dread. Something was wrong. It was too quiet.
"Go to your room and play,"
he said to Shauna. She looked at him with puzzled blue eyes.
"Get,"
he said softly but lovingly. He shooed her off with his hands, and she skipped off to play with her dolls, grabbing an apple from the basket on the table. Alan looked around the empty room. It looked neat and tidy, like what he usually returned home to, but there was no smell of dinner perfuming the air. Jo Beth was nowhere to be seen when she normally would be bustling around, setting the table with Jonah chatting around her. Something was terribly wrong. Alan felt it the moment he walked into work that morning. Simpson was not there until later in the day, which was unusual. He acted strange and distant to Alan once he returned. Fear enveloped him. Something was just not right. He immediately ran out the door. Shauna perched on the edge of the bed she shared with Jo Beth, her favorite doll clutched to her chest. An ominous silence filled the room. The slammed door left the air thick and heavy in its wake. Watching tensely for any movement or sound, she felt a chill run through her. Something was very wrong. It did not take Alan long to spot Jo Beth slumped over Jonah's dead body. He ran up to her, panting. Grief spread over his face instantly, and a moan escaped his throat. Jo Beth lifted her blood-streaked face to Alan's tortured one. "He's gone," she said hoarsely, reaching her hand out to him. Alan's knees gave out from under him, and he fell beside Jonah and Jo Beth. A sob caught in his throat. He placed a hand over Jonah's open, glazed eyes and closed them, searching Jo Beth's grief-stricken face for questions he already knew the answers to. His eyes glistened with tears. "It's my fault," he choked, his words barely audible. Jo Beth gently took his hand away from Jonah's eyes and held it tightly. "No," she said through a stuffy nose. "Not your fault," she repeated, shaking her head. She took a deep breath and rubbed her eyes. Alan looked at Jo Beth with quivering lips. His shoulders shook and he began to cry. Jo Beth embraced him and stroked his soft brown hair lovingly. Jonah had been right. Alan and Shauna would need her even more now. "I should have moved us last year, when I thought there might be danger," Alan cried, holding on to Jo Beth for life. "No, Alan," Jo Beth soothed softly. "It was winter, and we were freezing. You did what you had to do, for us. And we were so happy, if just for a little while." "But," Alan said, eyes rimmed red from tears, "I knew I should have stayed home today." "No, Alan," Jo Beth whispered, fingers running through his hair. She noticed Jonah's dried blood stained on her fingers. Swallowing, she forced down the tightening of her throat and the fresh batch of guttural wails threatening to rise up and out of her. She closed her eyes. "Simpson's prejudice and fear are why Jonah lies here dead, slaughtered like an animal. Not yours. Jonah knew this." "How could he?" wanting the guilt that plagued him to leave. "He told me, and he told me he loved you." Jo Beth smiled, giving birth to fresh tears. "He loved us all and wasn't afraid to die anymore. He said there are many waiting for him in heaven, so he won't be alone." Jo Beth sighed and looked down at Jonah. The body did not even look like the boy she loved and lived with. It was just an empty shell. Jonah was gone. She cupped her hand to her mouth, trying to control the urge to burst out crying. Alan needed her to be strong for him. Later, she would mourn for her beloved friend in private. "He told me we were not to cry for him. We had to be strong for each other. That we still had each other and Shauna." Alan placed his head in Jo Beth's lap and cried. She put her arms protectively around him and rested her head on his back as Alan shook with grief. "We have to be strong for each other," she cried, Jonah's words ringing in her ears. He was very wise. One of the wisest people I've ever had the pleasure to know. I promised him we would be strong, Alan. I promised." She held him and cried with him until night fell across the land, and the cold became unbearable. "Shauna will start to look for us," Alan sniffed, releasing his grip on JoBeth. She nodded, trying to fix her hair. "I will have to clean up before she sees me." JoBeth stood up on sore, cramped legs. She had been crouched in the same position since finding Jonah that morning. "What do I tell her?" Alan choked back a sob about to release again. She paused, her head bowed, and her gaze fixed on the creek and the moon's reflections on its rippling surface. Her slender figure was eerily still. She stepped back slowly, her feet silent in the grass, her pale green dress soaked in blood, blowing stiff in the breeze. Alan stood as if paralyzed, as she moved gracefully through the trees, like a fairy tale creature, into the shadows of the forest, her whispered words still hanging in the breeze. "The truth. We tell her the truth." "I am so in love with her, Jonah," Alan whispered to the air. JoBeth's form faded out of sight. An unseasonably warm breeze blew over him, blowing into his ear. He could have sworn he heard, "I know," in its warmth. He looked down at the empty body of Jonah. "I will miss you, my brother," Alan said numbly. "More than you know." Leaves rustled in the trees behind Alan. He turned back, confused. There were no leaves on the trees. The last had fallen off days before. They buried Jonah the next day beside JoBeth's son. Alan was bewildered by her insistence as to where Jonah was to rest. "This is where he has to be. It is very beautiful and peaceful in the summer. Jonah once told me it was like God was right there," JoBeth said, trying to avoid Alan's questioning eyes. "All right then, that is where he will be." When 3 mourners reached the site of the burial, Alan looked at the cross already placed in the ground. "It looks like someone else thought this was a good place too," he said to JoBeth. She looked away from him, guilt flooding her soul. She wanted to tell Alan that her son lay beneath the tiny grave marker. She wanted to reveal to him how Jonah had asked to be buried here, beside his namesake, but she was afraid she would lose Alan if he knew the truth. It was a chance she was not going to take. Alan began digging as JoBeth and Shauna stood back, teary-eyed, and watched. They cried openly without reservation as Alan began scooping dirt over the wooden coffin. No more deep laughter echoing through the day. No more talks. No more Jonah. He was gone forever. JoBeth stood staring at the 2 crosses erect in the cool air. Alan was on one side of her, and Shauna on the other. "Goodbye, dear friend. Take care of mine in heaven. My life will always have a hole now that you are not here to fill it. What a blessing you were, if just for a short time. Sleep well. We will all be together again one day," JoBeth said, looking at both crosses. "I will never forget you." Alan placed a warm arm around her shoulder, and she smiled at him as she clutched Shauna's hand. "We'll be all right," JoBeth coaxed Alan. "If anything should happen to you too," Alan breathed, bending his face to JoBeth's loose hair. "Shh." JoBeth placed her index finger on Alan's moist lips. "Nothing is going to happen to us." She hugged the 2 sobbing people, holding them dear to her. "Please," she prayed in her mind. Please don't take them from me, too. Alan went to town later in the day to sell the livestock while JoBeth and Shauna packed their belongings.
Don't open the door for anyone,
he said to JoBeth before he left. I won't, JoBeth said, cupping Alan's face in her hands. They felt warm and smooth. He gazed into her kind face, hating to leave, but having no choice. Winter was nearly upon them, and he wanted to purchase a horse and covered wagon to protect them from the elements. He did not want to travel on foot again. It had nearly killed them the last time. They had come too far to regress back to the beginning. They were not the same people they had been a year ago. JoBeth? Shauna asked, handing the older girl some of her dresses. They were in their bedroom sorting through their belongings. It was the last room to pack. Yes, JoBeth said, absently folding clothes. At school. Shauna stopped, afraid of the answer she would receive. What is it? JoBeth looked up from her folding. Shauna's blonde head was lowered, and her 2 braids hung down on each side of her small shoulders. Well, the children said I would be taken away. Her eyes looked beseechingly at JoBeth. Sympathy filled her as she reached out, grasping Shauna's light form, bringing the child into her comforting embrace. No one will ever take you away from me, Shauna. No one, she said earnestly. Queenie jumped up from her resting place on the floor and began to growl. A shiver ran up JoBeth's spine. Both of them turned to the door. Stay here, she ordered, standing up. Queenie stood up protectively beside JoBeth, teeth bared. JoBeth! Shauna squealed. JoBeth put her palm up to silence the frightened child and crept to the locked front door leading outside. Come on out, you whore, came a female voice from behind the entrance. We don't want trash like you around our children, yelled another female voice. A chorus of approval rang out. JoBeth peeked out the window and saw about 20 women with small children held tight to their sides. One plump, middle-aged woman with a toddler in her arms lifted a rock from the ground and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, causing JoBeth to jump, screaming as her hands covered her ears. Shauna came running out of the room, terrified. JoBeth! She squealed, frightened. The loft! Go to the loft and hide under the bed, JoBeth said, running to Shauna. Queenie started to bark as rocks began to pelt against the little house, crashing through windows and denting the sides. Shauna scurried up the stairs and looked down at the older girl with wide, frightened eyes. Send out the child, whore! Came an angry voice from outside. JoBeth grabbed the snarling Queenie and wrapped her arm protectively around the furry neck. The dog licked her face, whining and growling, baring her teeth maniacally at the door. It's all right, girl, she soothed. Come on, Alan, hurry back. She glued her eyes to the door and did not move. Knowing Shauna would be scared up in the loft alone, JoBeth wrung her hands together, feeling guilty. She was not there to comfort the poor child. Go upstairs, Queenie. Go see Shauna. JoBeth spoke into the animal's ear. The dog whined and turned to go up the stairs. She looked back at JoBeth, ears alert. Go see Shauna, JoBeth hissed, grabbing a chair to place under the door handle. Queenie obeyed and went to the waiting arms of the little girl. Shauna was relieved to have the dog's warm, furry body to hold on to. If you think you can whore around our town, you got another thing comin', yelled another voice. JoBeth grabbed a log from the woodpile and stood in a defensive pose, ready. She would do what she had to do to protect herself and Shauna. No one was taking from her, and no one would hurt either of them again. Alan, please hurry back, JoBeth whispered, afraid more than she had ever been in her life. Hurry. That afternoon, Alan rode up the familiar path to the house he had shared with JoBeth Jonah, and Shauna for more than a year. He was seated on the front bench of a covered wagon. A brown mare and a spotted brown and white filly pulled the cart easily up the path. He reached the house and noticed the battered appearance. Glass was shattered everywhere, and rocks littered the once immaculate entrance. JoBeth and Jonah had cleared out the weeds and branches that littered the path, taking care to give it a simple yet appealing exterior. Now it was unrecognizable. Panic seized him. "Whoa!" He reined in the horses, which gave a startled snort. Alan dropped the reins, jumped off the wagon, and ran to the sealed door. It was jammed, and he pushed full force with his shoulder trying to get in. "JoBeth, Shauna!" he yelled frantically, pushing the door slightly ajar. "Alan?" he heard from the other side. Relief filled his soul. He could hear JoBeth moving objects away from the door. "Alan!" she cried, opening the door to his bewildered face. She had never felt so glad to see him as she flung herself into his arms and hugged him tightly, afraid that his husky presence might not be real. "Where is Shauna?" He peered over JoBeth's shoulder. Rocks and glass littered the once tidy room. "I'm here," Shauna chimed over the railing of the loft. "Thank God," he panted, squeezing JoBeth back. "We were so frightened. They called me horrible names, and they threw stones. They came to take Shauna." "Don't cry. They're gone now," Alan soothed, patting the back of JoBeth's long, loose hair. JoBeth pulled away from Alan's strong embrace. "Did you get the wagon?" JoBeth asked. He nodded. Tears filled her eyes. The reality of leaving their beloved little home flooded her. Jonah was here. Her baby was here. "Why?" she wailed angrily. "Why did they have to kill Jonah? Why did they steal him away from us? Why did they have to ruin our home? Why?" She sobbed, unable to stop. "I loved him so much. I loved our home." JoBeth fell to the floor, crying into the palms of her hands. She was leaving so much behind. "JoBeth," Alan pleaded. "Please, JoBeth." He bent down and placed his large, strong hands around her tear-streaked face. JoBeth looked at him, sniffling. "We have to leave. I don't want to leave Jonah either, but we have to." He looked at the debris thrown aggressively across the floor, and JoBeth could see his eyes water. "What they did to Jonah." "Alan." JoBeth felt ashamed by her outburst. "No." He jumped up, glaring at JoBeth. She shivered. Alan had never before acted this way. "JoBeth, don't. You understand what they could do to us, to Shauna?" Shauna gasped, clinging to Queenie's neck. JoBeth stood up. Jonah's last words, "to be strong," rang in her ears. She patted her messy hair down, looking up to the loft with a forced smile. "Come on down, honey, and help me pack," JoBeth said to the silent child whose eyes were big with worry. Goosebumps crawled over JoBeth's skin. For a moment, the child looking down was that same haunted child JoBeth had escaped with so long ago. Slowly, Shauna crawled down the stairs and grabbed JoBeth's hand tightly. Reassuringly, JoBeth squeezed it back. "Did you have any trouble selling the animals?" JoBeth asked. "No, we had good animals. They just want us out of their town. I sold them quickly." He smiled shyly at JoBeth, wanting to kiss her. "Wait till you see the horses. They are beautiful." "Well then," JoBeth forced a grin, "let's see them." They ate in silence and then packed their belongings in the wagon. JoBeth made up a bed in the back, putting the fatigued Shauna down to sleep. It was getting late, and they wanted to be on their way. They stopped at the grave one last time to say goodbye. Standing beside Alan, she stared at the two stark crosses. the only reminders that the two buried beneath had existed in this world. She wished they were coming with them. She bent down and fingered the dried red flowers on her son's grave. Her heart ached at leaving them behind, but Jonah had been right, as always. Alan and Shauna needed her, and they were alive. She felt she would never get over losing them, but she would live and love. She had to. She had promised Jonah, and it was the only way she could survive.
Are you ready?
Alan questioned, watching her caress the dried seed heads. JoBeth was almost 16 and had already lived a life far beyond her years. She had lost her parents, a child, and a best friend in little more than 2 years. The pain was there. It probably always would be. She looked at the man standing by her, and her sad heart lightened. She snapped one of the flowers into her hand and stood tall. She would take part of them with her. Somewhere, someday, she would plant those seeds. She placed a mittened hand on Alan's arm and smiled peacefully at him. "Now I am," she said. Seated back in the wagon, Alan clicked his tongue and slapped the reins down onto the horses' backs. The wagon began to move forward. Alan was worth going on for. He was only 17, yet despite his age, when she looked into his eyes, she felt a sense of security that had eluded her since her parents' death. Maybe even longer if she thought about it. Maybe since that fateful day when her brother fell out of the tree and broke his neck and the domino effect that followed. She turned and faced the road. The sky had turned gray and cool. She snuggled into her wrap and sighed, clutching the dried flower in her hand. They would make it. They had to make it.